So, hi everybody, and welcome to a special edition here of Quantum Connections on QuantumPlanet World and Quantum Plant Healing. Myself and Bella are very excited to be in a conversation today with the wonderful Stefan, geophysicist, who we have been following now for a number of months and who's been helping us to make sense of some of our own work in relation to the activities of the sun. So without further ado, Stefan, introduce yourself please to our audience. How are you doing, brother?
Hello. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And yeah, happy to be here. Um, and it's interesting because you reached out, and I mean, I get a lot of emails coming into the inbox now through the channel, but you were persistent. And there's also more than that. It was that there was actually something of interest and value there, because I get some weird emails and stuff, and yours is actually backed up with a little bit of meat, you could say, like, hey, I've been working with plants for years. And then we started talking about that, and it's like, okay, there's clearly something here. So happy that this is finally working out now. I'm glad that you watched the channel and that yeah, I've helped you in some aspect better understand the energies. I'm still learning all this. I'd say I'm still very new into this. I just have a certain kind of structure and work methodology, I think, that helps me to kind of rapidly learn things and then present them. So I think others are liking that. So, but I'm not, a lot of work to do.
Well, for sure. One of the things that we like about your presentations and the information you share is just how much detail you put into them, Stefan, but also the range of different things that you bring in, including astrology, including a little bit of plant medicine, things that we're both interested in. But today, I think we're going to be looking at something that is perhaps more even in Bella's realm, which is to do with cycles of time and how this might relate to sun activity, even astrological activity. And so the focus of this interview, or this call, we can say, is to bring together the various different modalities we have and perhaps try and present some sort of gestalt or tableau or picture with our various maybe higher selves communicating here as a transmission, bringing together the different forces that we're all looking at, because they're all part of a much bigger jigsaw design that we can say that maybe is going to be initiated on the upcoming eclipse on the 8th. That's kind of why we're doing this call just now, but maybe also to see what's going to come after that. And we've been doing a lot of research in relation to Bella's Mind and Magic course that she's just put out, but really we wanted to see how this relates to the activities of the sun, because in the world which we work in, we perceive the sun to be a very conscious, sentient being who's also on its own trajectory, very much like we perceive the archetypes and energies of the planets and asteroids in astrology. That might be a little bit far out for some people, but what I've noticed is that the solar flares and solar activities have this kind of level of precision that is really interesting when they hit the Earth. And so that's the kind of the preface from my side. Bella, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so as part of the research, which is connected to the Mayan long counts and all the different calendars, I have found how the sun has a big change every 5,200 years or 125 years roughly. And so I want to see from your research, you were sharing a little bit about your course and what you were doing as well. What have you found about the big cycles of the sun? And more we're understanding it is a conscious being, and it's going through its evolution process as well, just as we are. So what have you found in all of these processes?
Well, the basic is that there's like an 11 to 12-year solar cycle called a Schwab cycle, and this is just where the magnetic field flips. So you have a North Pole, South Pole, you have different polarities, and they just simply reorganize and flip based on some mechanism. We really don't know. Some people think they have the answer as to why, but if we're being honest, we really don't know why it flips. We just see that it does. That's the observation that we make. That happens every 11 years. In general, with the universe, if you start to study it in just life, we see that there's cycles upon cycles. And so you start to go mad because you start to just see all these different cycles embedded in top of each other, and it just shorts your circuits. So you have that Schwab cycle, which is 11 years, then that is stacked into a longer Gleisberg cycle, which is 88 years long on average. And our data set for that's pretty limited. We don't have that much data on this. We would ideally like 10,000 years of sunspot records. then you really have a whole bunch. If we make the Gleisberg cycle 100 years, you have 10,000 years, that gives you 100 Gleisberg cycles to look at, if we were to simplify the math. But we have 3 under our belt right now that we've looked at, because we have sunspot numbers going back to like about 1700, a little bit before. They've gone better over time, but they're pretty good starting at 1700. You can do indirect measurements looking at like geologic data to recreate the sunspot number, but now you're starting to play with statistics and recreations, and we don't know. But we had people pointing telescopes at the sun, looking and counting the number of sunspots on a daily basis or a weekly basis from 1700 to now. So we have 3 centuries of data, and we have 3 Gleisberg cycles at 88 years. So that seems to be some trend where solar activity increases and decreases on an 88-year time frame. Then based on these longer time scales, that's based on the recreation, the data that they recreate. This is based off of like atmospheric data and tree rings. And, it's not to be discounted completely, but we should just put a little bit of caution around it. That's like a longer 2,400-year cycle. And I haven't researched into that one all that much, but the general thing I think we can be pretty confident in is that the sun has all these different cycles embedded within itself, and they're all playing out at different times. So you could have a weak Schwab cycle, the normal 11-year cycle. You could have a very weak one, but maybe it's stacked on top of a strong Gleisberg cycle, and it's just hard to tease it out. And then you also have to think about like light itself. Like light itself is a cycle, right? Photons cycle at either let's say like 1 trillion times per second, like visible light's like around 1 trillion times per second. Ultraviolet light, X-ray light, gamma ray light is, extremely fast, like 10 to the 15, 10 to the 20. These are cycles. So the cycles go all the way from like a gigasecond, I guess you could say, like, insanely fast, all the way to 2,400 years. And then I'm sure there's solar cycle activities that are 100,000 years long and 1,000,000 years long. And it's just really what record of that exists. Like if you make an action, typically you leave some sort of imprint. Anything. It's just finding the imprint. Can you identify what it is, and then get that data and present it? And so there's probably a lot of cycles out there, certainly, that have left imprints that we've just looked over them. We didn't see what we were seeing, right? And then, so we don't know about them. But we do know about these 11-year ones, the 88-year ones, the 2,400-year ones. And for a human time scale, that's the most relevant. Most people won't live beyond years.
I know that a lot of people, especially that are into stock market and all that, follow those cycles of the sun because they can see the trends with the sun and the fall of the stock markets. So there are lots of people that follow it because it's what happens in our world. It affects our economic system. It affects so many different, the political system, many different things. And what you were saying about the records, the Mayans actually have a stele with carvings for all of those cycles. So every time there was a new sun or a new long count cycle, they recorded this. They even followed Venus. They had the charts for Venus, the charts for Mars, Jupiter, and even for some constellations. So you could see when there was an alignment with Sirius, with the Pleiades, and it was all tracked. It's amazing. And there are still some codex that are survived the burning after the conquest.
And what you really see, Stefan, when you start looking at these micro and macro cycles, according to where you put your intention and attention, you can work with them. And I guess it's the same with what you're talking about. So we're starting to see this mirroring, particularly from the Mayan perspective, about why they wanted to track cycles so much. And of course, one of the things they really tracked closely were the eclipses, and maybe we'll get into that later in the call. But I think what we're looking at now is understanding cycles of energy, cycles of time, cycles of light, sun cycles. Of course, Here in Mexico, they talk about the time of the sixth sun, and they talk about the time of the fifth sun being created at Teotihuacan, the place or the birthplace of the gods, and how the gods actually created the sun that we've been living under. And now they're saying that we're going to move into a different period with a different sun. And some people have even perceived that the color of the sun has changed in the last few years. So, you know, there are many strange phenomena here that, because of the short duration of the current human lifespan, we can only see maybe up to 88 years. That is, I guess, probably about the average life of a relatively healthy human in the modern era. And so we only have what we've perceived ourselves that in any way we can subjectively say might be a truth. Anything that's beyond that is then hearsay or a record or a subjective opinion somebody else laid down. So when we start to look at time and cycles like this, we really can't be sure of a great deal unless it's been encoded in such a way and imprinted into a previous timeline like the Mayans did, so that we can then extrapolate from it, bring it forwards and see whether it still makes sense. So I guess we're kind of doing similar work, but from different perspectives, trying to see what part of a cycle we're in so that we can navigate through it as best as we can.
We also found that with the when they install the Gregorian time, because that is part of what I've understood more and more as well. Whoever controls your time can control your reality and what happens to you and to humanity. And we've seen how after the Gregorian time there were a series of time shifts and changes in government, and it came with the
technology,
in the 1800s with the Greenwich Meridian time. So a series of insertions of different realities, and then the shaping of what is now the industrialized world. So we've been keeping track of those things, but definitely since 2020 I was taking pictures of the sun and it looked very yellow and not as bright, and I have the pictures from 2020 onwards and it's white and huge, super bright. I've been keeping track of that as well.
Yeah, well, X-ray flux in extreme ultraviolet light goes up by an order of magnitude during solar maximum. So during solar minimum, you have 5 times or 10 times less of the most vibrational wavelengths. And I mean, we have a very limited range of light that we see, but some people it's slightly wider, and then our optics can change. So, I mean, visible light's right on that boundary. So there's probably some change there too. I mean, total solar radiance, which includes like heat and all that stuff, radio waves, is pretty stable. It's like the ocean, 6,000 feet deep, and there's waves at the surface. And so those can have a height of sometimes even like 50 feet or something. But generally, the ocean floor is 6,000 feet down. So you do have these fluctuations in the light itself, and maybe that could account for the sun looking a little different with our human eyeballs. Also, just like the atmospheric quality of the day, there's a whole bunch of things. But yeah, the idea of like cycles too, I think there's a general amnesia that is also in play. I mean, for example, when I was young, and I'm not that old, when I was young, if I went to the East Coast, I would see fireflies everywhere. And now it's very rare to see a firefly. And actually, the last firefly I saw was in Costa Rica. I was out swimming in the ocean. A firefly like landed on my shoulder when I was like out in the water. And Costa Rica is a pretty healthy environment. They have them. And I just listened to an interview with RFK Jr., and he was talking about his childhood growing up on the East Coast and how there was all these different animals and salamanders and everything, like, crazy diverse. And I had a sense of that a little bit as a kid because I went to the East Coast when I was young and I saw the fireflies and I heard the frogs. And now, I mean, we got a bald eagle, which is cool, but there's been a complete degradation of like the lower life forms, and the overall diversity has gone down. And I think people have amnesia to that. They're not even aware of it. And this is just like my example, my metaphor, but this is like so in your face because like frogs are making a lot of noise. When you get enough of them, it is crazy how loud they can be. There's a friend of mine has like a pond where it's just on his property, the water's healthy, and there's like hundreds of frogs in there, and it's like crazy loud. And there's just like people have just like forgotten this stuff. And so this applies also to like the sun and solar phenomenon and all these natural things. I think our society in general is very distracted. And so it's these cycles are playing out. Are you paying attention to them? And then also there's a natural memory amnesia effect going back in time. And that contributes to the whole kind of warping of time, as you described, Davyd, with like how time is not really linear. Like, I know what you mean when you say that, because then if you build your perceptions up on time that has a different character than it actually was, it influences the future going forward. And yeah, it's very interesting.
Right. I mean, the classic example that we would give around this is a very simple day-to-day one. Maybe there's an accident on a street, 3 people have to give a witness statement. Each one gives the statement truthfully in the way that they saw it. But when the 3 are put together, they all read slightly differently. Which one is the truth? Well, they're all the truth, and maybe none of them know the truth. And I think that when we use that very simple day-to-day exercise, we can start to go, well, hold on a second. How much of any of the written history have we been given? And even if we look at the last 4 years, the narratives presented on the television maybe do not correspond with the narratives or experiences that many of us have actually had. And if those were then embedded into history as the truth, as many things have been over the last 200 years or more, and we believe those things, then does that mean that they were real? And there's so much from the last 4 years that we can perceive isn't real in our sense, but maybe for other people was super real. Which one is more real than the other? I mean, again, it's very subjective, and it's a difficult thought to conceive, because then your reality starts to wobble very noticeably, and you're not really sure what's true and what's not anymore, which is where it has to come back to self-discernment and self-truth. So we're not trying to mess with people's heads too much, but we do have this kind of phenomenon where we say, well, linear time is something real, and the truth is it's not really. It's more like some sort of spiral that we can jump across to other, we can say, timelines, and maybe experience or access sometimes when we're working with sacred plant medicine, sometimes when we're doing transcendental meditation, we can access these other, we can say, timelines, but they're not necessarily in the past as a past life. They're somehow still concurrent because we're still experiencing them in the present. So if the past is still active, does that mean that it's finished and concluded in a linear sense? That can't be correct. So we have to also use some sort of logic in all of this, which is where studying the cycles of time gives us these sort of mechanisms through which we can access the past or the future, all of which is going on right now.
And remember that throughout history, at least the one they've shown us, every time there's been a war or any kind of conquest, they rewrite history. Whoever won that war will rewrite history and delete any previous records so that they can sell us that history and then moving on. And then it seems to be very frequent. Every 200 years, there seems to be like another reality or another history that is put in place.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of these things are kind of easy to see through if you have at least 2 brain cells. Like a good example is the Nazi gold, and how the Nazis accumulated all this gold, and we found it when we started really pressing heavily into German territory. We found Merker's mine, and we found this whole huge stash of gold. And General Patton was very, kind of brash, but very much for the people. He was like, let's give every American son of a bitch, like every U.S. soldier, a gold eagle. and everyone's like, oh, like everyone else is like, no, we're going to return it to the proper owners, that whole deal, right? We should have done what Patton wanted, though, because it would have been given to the soldiers. Yes, it wasn't given to, let's say, the Europeans, but they would have spent it and would have gone right back into like the overall ground economy. Whereas instead, the United States government took it, and now they'll say that 90% went back to the original owners. Well, a lot of those original owners were killed in the Holocaust, like 6 million plus people. There's no way they're ever going to get their possessions back. That money went straight into like American vaults and American banks, and you have to be a fool to think otherwise. And so Patton's idea of giving these gold eagles to the soldiers, it wasn't to like the Europeans that it was stolen from, but it would have, in terms of its energetics, gone. A lot of them stayed stationed in Europe. Most of it would have like gone back into the ground economy, and like I think that karma would have resolved itself. But instead, it so they say 90% went back to the victims, but that's just simply not true. So they just simply rewrote it.
And even to take it further.
Yeah, please.
To take it even further, it's always the same 13 families from Phoenician times or even farther back that are the ones in charge of those wars, and it's just moving the money from one pocket to another, and just so that they can sell more of the same things, because they are the ones that benefit from selling weapons, from selling all of the horrible things, from destroying here and rebuilding here, because they are in charge of rebuilding, so they make money out of that.
And actually, when we look into the records, we can see that the acquisition of gold has been something that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. If you go back to the Great Zimbabwe, there are records there showing that there was gold extraction going on there thousands, if not tens of thousands, or maybe more years ago. And so what is the fascination with gold? I mean, we're going off now into a bit of a rabbit hole journey, but when we start to put the different timeline segments, we can see that the conquistadors really came to the Americas on one level looking for gold. Why was that? And where did all of this gold go? And where is it now? These are questions. And, once we start to look into the timeline cycles, we start to see that these occurrences gold is just one example, but there are often fires, there are often wars. And I think that also what you were referring to with the fireflies is what some people might call the Mandela effect. Songs that we swore blind had certain words in them back in the 80s, but now when we go back and listen to them, they don't have them anymore. And these kinds of phenomenon tend to suggest either we are having some part of us deleted, or something is getting deleted in the overall Akashic record, something we can say.
We're jumping timelines.
Or there are little bits of splicing going on, so that the splicing is almost 99.9% correct, but somehow a little bit of it wasn't quite correct. And so we've got these memories that somehow now don't tie into the present moment. So I guess what we're looking at here is a very fluid sense of how we experience reality. But really the reason we wanted to reach out to you and discuss all of this is to see how the sun plays a role in all of this, because clearly it must have a major influence. And I think the study of tree rings is interesting, dendrochronology. It doesn't tend to show so much sun cycles, but it does show when the sun gets obscured, which I think is really interesting. And they can track often volcanic explosions due to the stunting of the tree rings. So there are some mechanisms embedded into the natural landscape, which we can read things from. But also we have this amnesia. Why don't we have records dating back? If the Mayans were tracking these things, where are these records? Why were they deleted? Why don't we have records of why all of this gold disappeared, etc., etc., etc.? So we should be asking these questions, I think, as we move into this new era.
I don't know if you know this, Stefan, but the Mayans could track the eclipses to a precision of even 30 seconds more than the actual Western science can do. So the level of precision was so high. And what they believed is that on the total solar eclipses, because of the lack of sunlight, there could be other type of entities that could come, and they prepare really well for those moments. So I think we can go into the conversations about the eclipse. What is happening with the sun right now, from what you know? And obviously, these eclipses were always connected to changes in humanity, and they have been tracking those. So what do you think is happening now with the sun, and how do you see it reflecting onto what's going on?
And actually, also to add to that question, Stefan, I'd love to hear your opinion based on all of the different modalities that you study with and are into. What do you perceive an eclipse to actually be, energetically, astrologically? Because it can be many different things, and we always like to look at things from a very broad-ranging perspective and see what resonates without necessarily pinning our colors to any particular mass, but to try and feel into what could be about to happen, what has happened. And yes, I'd love your take on that too.
I'll just feel into that as well, because I don't have any hard and fast belief on eclipses. But let me share the solar graphic that we discussed earlier. And so here is the sun, as we can see. And a lot of people have been talking about this eclipse and kind of speculating that it's going to have a huge burst of activity. A lot of these people don't track space weather all that closely. I'm just talking about like general Western tropical astrologers on YouTube. But we had a ton of solar activity and a really strong geomagnetic storm, the strongest geomagnetic storm in 7 years for the lunar eclipse. So the first half of the cycle that kicked it off. And now we have the total solar eclipse coming up on the 8th. Solar activity has actually gone way down. The extremely vibrational wavelengths of light, like X-rays and such, have gone down by an order of magnitude baseline. And the only thing that's popped up now, as we can see, is this single sunspot here. So for the eclipse on the 8th, that will be about Earth direct. It'll be in this center strike zone. Now, keep in mind, there is a really mega sunspot group on the back side of the sun right now. So on the opposite side of the sun, there is a huge sunspot group. And that's the sunspot that launched the coronal mass ejection that resulted in that really powerful geomagnetic storm coinciding with the lunar eclipse within only a few hours. And the rotation period of the sun is about 28 days. So that mega sunspot group will actually be on about the opposite side of the sun as when the total solar eclipse happens, which is interesting. Right. Because the lunar period is 14 days, average, just approximate. So, yep. But we do have this sunspot group here, this little tiny one. It could grow rapidly, it could do something, but overall total solar radiance is down. And I mean, in regards to the eclipse, I can turn this off now. In regards to the eclipse, it's interesting because, I mean, if we just step back, it's the sun just, sun's always there. We're rotating around it. Our orbit doesn't change that much. If you look at some of these other things in our solar system, they have these crazy orbits. They're like highly eccentric. So they're close in one point and far away in another. But our orbit has a very low eccentricity. So actually, as we orbit around the sun, it's pretty normal. There's very little variation. Now, if there was a huge variation, then, that could add on to this story. But there's not. There's very little variation. So the sun's not really changing position. We're rotating, but we're not really changing our distance from it in a significant way, you could say, on this time scale. But the moon is coming in, and that's the big agent of change there, is that the moon rotates around and precisely hits that alignment and blocks the sun directly. It's the exact same size at that relative scale. Gravitationally, it's about the same as well. The sun, of course, we're rotating around the sun gravitationally, but gravity is interesting in that it works based on your local, it's a field. So if you're the biggest object in your field and there's a really big one over there, but it's distant, its effect is less, and you can be the gravitational juggernaut. And actually, that's the deal with Planet X, which is why I've been researching into Planet X, and that's kind of the next thing, and maybe we'll go into that just a little bit. It's very it's very preliminary and what's the word? Not at all confirmed, but there may be a big alignment happening with Planet X later this month with Uranus and Jupiter. But that's again very, very
let's get into that now, Stefan.
We have notes about that.
We're into the far out stuff on all levels, and particularly working with plants for so long, sometimes have the gift to see other things that other people can't see, particularly in the energy realms. And so, give us your take on Planet X. This is a show where we can go as far out as we want and hold ideas, not necessarily, like we said, pinning our colors to a mast, but holding ideas and philosophies that may or may not have some relevance and resonance for others. So tell us more on where you see Planet X and fitting into this, and perhaps what is Planet X, because there's quite a few different versions of that story as well.
Yeah, well, I'll wrap the whole thing up in one nice, hopefully deliverable, because the eclipse is you have the moon going in front, and then you have this period of darkness, right? And right now, total solar irradiance has gone down dramatically after those big outbursts with the lunar eclipse, where the moon's over here. So we're getting double energy. We have the sun releasing tons of energy, and the moon reflecting more energy in, big energy increase. And now we're getting this big energy drop. So that's the wave height has increased. Instead of it being some small wave, you're getting this really big wave. big push on the lunar, very big drop on the total. That's what it seems so far. We have to wait to see what actually happens with the total, but it's this big drop. But the interesting thing about the eclipse is, you have this aspect of darkness casting this shadow on the Earth. You mentioned like it's perhaps a prime time for like entities or something. Like I can't comment too much on that, though I do have experience there. But I mean, if I was an entity, that probably would be a good time. So that I would probably time it. But so you have this kind of like this aspect of blocking the power of the sun, taming the power of the sun, that kind of deal. And just the aspect of like Shiva and darkness and chaos, like there's these events that happen, these unique energies that happen around eclipses. Like right now, in terms of space weather, it's pretty quiet. There's not really much happening in terms of the Schumann resonances. They're pretty much normal. But I know that the energies right now are pretty strong, and people are reacting to those. So, I mean, I have some friends that are like, "Why are we feeling this way?" And it's like, well, maybe it's the eclipses. Like, there's just kind of out of the blue. So these energies work differently, and they're kind of like a background behind the curtain way. Like they're very subtle and sometimes almost like dark in influence, I guess you could say, which ties into the moon blocking the sun. And so what I find interesting about all that, you have that symbology. And then about 12 days later, we have Jupiter and Uranus conjuncting in Taurus. And as I was researching into the trans-Newtonian objects, especially the ones that are really out there, like Sedna, if you've ever heard of Sedna, it's a small dwarf planet, smaller than Pluto, that has this extremely elliptical orbit. So it comes in at about 70 astronomical units, which is well outside the orbit of Neptune and Pluto. It's about 20 AU away from Pluto at its closest. So it's a distant influence. It's a tiny little thing. And then it flings all the way out into interstellar space, outside the heliosphere, outside the normal influence of the sun, way out there into the interstellar region, and gets those energies. And then every 12,000 years, it completes this loop. And so as I was researching into Sedna, I have a little bit of a good, I'm like a bloodhound a little bit. So I started to see some hints for some other directions. And so I chased them. And these trans-Newtonian objects, all their orbits align. The ones that we have found, they're all kind of skewed in one direction and at the same tilt. So it's not random. There's some organizing principle.
Right.
And I mentioned how the effect of gravity depends on where you are. So yeah, the sun's, of course, has the strongest gravity in our area that we know of. But if you go 200 astronomical units out and you drop Jupiter there, Jupiter is going to control the gravity of a huge, huge, huge region, because the sun's very distant in its effect. It's still going to affect Jupiter. Now Jupiter and the sun are going to do something, right? But it'll be this big orbit or whatever. But the effect of Jupiter in that part of space-time is going to be very, very large. And so these researchers that found Sedna, and these researchers out of Caltech and some other groups that have been looking at these trans-Newtonian objects, they started to do calculations on what could cause all those orbits to go in one direction, or generally skew in one direction away from the sun. Instead of being, here, 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 like this. And they also have the same tilt. And they modeled what they call Planet 9 or Planet X. And they were able to get some models to show that it has a mass of about 3 to 10 of the Earth. But the best estimate right now is like 6 Earth mass. And that its orbit takes like 3,500 years. And it's so far out that it is the gravitational controller of all those trans-Newtonian objects in addition to the sun. So the sun influences those, but it then will swing in and it enters into these resonances with planet X. So we think, based on some pretty good science. I read through the papers; they're pretty good. These are the groups that found Sedna and these other objects. So they're pretty highly acclaimed researchers, from what I can tell. And so it is a very strong organizing influence on the outer, like the very far outer boundary of our solar system. And so they've been constantly improving their calculations and modeling for this planet 9 and reducing, like figuring out what the statistical likelihood of it just being a probability effect. And so the probabilities that keep going lower, like, you know, just a less than 1% probability this would happen naturally, which makes you think that there's some organizing influence. And then so they've been improving the orbital parameters, the size of it, what they think it is. They think it's a gas giant that was ejected early from the solar system, but still retain an orbit around the sun, just very distant. So it's like the core of like Jupiter or something, the core of Saturn, something like that. And so then a group just like a year ago, they did a search to the database for all the different asteroids that come in. We have these different asteroid and meteorite observatories, and they found one that came in at a really high inclination. So it struck at a weird angle, and they were specifically looking for asteroids that perhaps came from the outer reaches of the solar system. From the far Kuiper belt, or even the Oort cloud, which is like this distant cloud on the very edge. And so they then modeled that trajectory. They did a whole bunch of math, which I didn't understand, but you know, they did it's crazy stuff. I would have to get a PhD to understand some of this math, but they did a lot of good, like reductionist kind of first principle science, you could say. And then they matched that up. They were thinking, well, what caused it to like come in? Like if it's just zooming around out there, what caused it to dislodge and hit our planet? And it traced right back to the highest probability zone for planet 9 in regards to the research that's been published. You know, they have this probability zone for where planet 9 is, its orbit, and then also where it's most likely in that orbit. It's just probability based. And this thing tracked 3 different measures of this asteroid, tracked right to the high probability zone. And they gave the angle for that in terms of the solar system grid, which is based on right ascension and declination. And so right ascension is 0 degrees of Pisces in sidereal, not Western tropical, but just actual true sky position, 0 degrees of Pisces. And then you just add degrees to that to get 360, and then your angle is either up or down, right? And so the number they gave was 53 degrees, and that puts it at 23 degrees of Aries in sidereal.
Oh my God!
Oh, you're magic, right?
Well, wait. That's sidereal. That's sidereal. So you know this total solar eclipse is happening in Pisces for sidereal. But for Western tropical, it's happening in Aries. So this is sidereal location. Aries. But then if you add on 24 degrees to take it to Western tropical astrology, if you do 53 plus 24, you get 77. So you jump forward 2 signs because that's 60 degrees. So you go through Pisces and Aries, click. And then you have 17 degrees left over. So the highest probability zone, based on a variety of different research angles for this planet X or planet 9, which again, we've never seen, we don't have any telescope data for, but just based on indirect measurements, is at 17 degrees of Taurus with a probability range of like plus or minus 4 degrees. And that conjunction is happening at 21 degrees of Taurus between Jupiter and Uranus. So it's right in that zone. This is all just a big what if. But it's just very interesting because you have this darkness influence of the solar eclipse and everything. You have Jupiter and Uranus coming in. Jupiter and Uranus is this big shakeup, right? And so then you have Jupiter, you have Saturn in between that's not participating directly. You have Uranus perhaps then after Neptune, then you also have the fifth gas giant, Planet X, also in a triple conjunction, which is like probably the most rare thing you could have, because that orbit is so slow and so long. For you to get a triple conjunction between those 3 points would be crazy. Like we can look at Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto conjunctions, and they only happen every 3,500 years, something like that, and they're not exactly precise. So we could be in a Jupiter, Uranus, Planet X conjunction at this moment in time. But I need to do more looking into this. But yeah, it's a fun thing. So
we love that you love your research, because we call it to be Scorpio. We're both very Scorpio, so we go into research big time as well. But not only in the scientific field, we also go into the astral research and the esoteric research. And when you talk about Planet X, it very much matches the cycle of Nibiru. I don't know how much you've read about it, but also last year we started to see the planet in our astral visions. We started to see it in November from last year. We saw the colors, we saw the size, absolutely massive. It is really big. I'd say probably about 5 to 8 times the size of the Earth, and it looked so close.
In fact, we both woke up one morning, Stefan, and we both said, "Hey, I just had this really weird dream when I saw really, really clearly a planet right there in our visual awareness." And the other one was like, I saw the same thing. And actually, reflecting on what you've said, it was, to me, the color of it was a very bluey turquoise color, so it could be gaseous in that respect. But what's also interesting, and this is where we start to link in the sulking of the Mayan time, is that the April 8th eclipse starts on the next wave spell, which will be with the white magnetic dog, and it finishes 13 days later on that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which would be a day of transcendence. And so by tracking these 13-day cycles over the last few years, we've worked with them for healing spaces, for containers, for many different types of shamanic journeys, is that due to the nature of what the Mayans observed, that these 13-day cycles always encapsulate a whole series of personal, but also transpersonal galactic energies at work. And so what we're understanding is that this eclipse heralds the beginning of something. And I think what you're now pointing towards with Planet X, we'll just continue to call it that for now, could be also the culmination of that particular little cycle of 13 days, because it's expected that there will be many seismic events around that time. And what you're suggesting, there's a new series on Netflix that some people have been watching called Free Body Problem, which is very interesting. It's about the possibility of 3 suns all coming together. Now, I'm wondering how much of that is disclosure, because there's lots of really interesting rabbit hole stuff in there. But maybe what we're looking at is this problem is that something else is in our universe that for some reason we cannot see currently. Maybe it's on a different level of electromagnetic light that we can't perceive it. Maybe this eclipse is going to reveal it. Maybe that's going to freak people out to see another.
It will freak people out.
Of course it will. If we suddenly see a big planet, it's like, oh my God, where did that come from? People are going to go, hey, this is Project Bluebeam. Don't worry about it. It's not real. And there'll be a bunch of us going, hey, I did a really sacred fungi journey last week, and that's absolutely real, by the way. Right? So we don't know how this is going to play out. But what we're trying to do is bring some awareness to the possibilities through science, through sacred traditions and cultures, which have lots of their own research behind them, and saying, well, how do we bring all of these different threads together to try and understand what may be about to happen here? But for sure, I think what you've just delivered is a very important piece of the jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to build.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very Uranian.
Really interesting part.
It's very Uranian and Jupiterian. Like that conjunction is all about these big, massive, transformative breakthroughs. And so let's say, just kind of playing with the idea of it, finding Planet X is a very Uranian Jupiterian conjunction energy. And I find it especially interesting because that's exactly on my ascendant. This conjunction is happening directly on my ascendant. And I just stumbled into this research. I mean, you can go on Google Scholar and read it. I mean, I had to read, find kind of, you have to sift through it. It takes some work. We talked about that before we went on. But it's not like this is backed up with no data. This is just based on the best available data. And of course, the probability, does it exist, A or B? We don't know. Okay, if it does, let's say it does. Where is it on that probability path? Is it on that probability path, right? If it is, where is it on that path? Is it at that highest probability zone of 53 right ascension angle. It's a lot of what ifs. But then that asteroid messenger is what they call it. That's a completely independent signal that lines right up with it. So then that's what makes me think, okay, now there's something here. And generally I follow what's like the rule of three. So you have three things. The first one would be this research done by the group that discovers Sedna and a lot of these other objects, making this probability path. They've been working on this for more than almost 10 years now, constantly refining it, adding more data, getting rid of bias. They have some good data and research showing how this clustering of objects, these transnewtonians, is not as a result of bias of where we're looking in the sky. Excuse me. And as best as we think. And then you have this asteroid messenger. That's point number 2. And then if we want to go on to a real limb, point number 3 could just be the energetic qualities of Jupiter Uranus conjuncting themselves. And for me personally, in my experience of reality, me finding this around the same time as all of that, with this conjunction happening on my ascendant. So for me, I have 3 different data points. One of them is very astrological and nebulous, right? One of them is based on asteroid messenger, and the third is the probability path. But there are 3 things all kind of pointing in one direction, which makes me just think about it and look at it a little more close than I would have otherwise. So yeah,
and the keywords for that conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus is paradigm shattering.
Yeah.
So something absolutely comes into our awareness and changes everything. So
yeah,
I think we're looking into very interesting wave spell.
Yeah.
They say that a lot of astrologers believe that when a new planet is found, like when, first it was Uranus after Saturn, and then it was Neptune, and then Pluto, and each one that goes further out is like finding a new dimension of consciousness and going a little deeper into consciousness.
Yes.
And we're on this consciousness evolution journey. And so, yeah, it would be paradigm shattering to find out that there is a planet X in the far, far distant outer reaches of our solar system. And that's not some tiny little Sedna. Sedna is just super tiny, right? It's cool. It has this interesting cycle. It's linked to human history, it seems. It's hard to get good data on it. I've been struggling with that in terms of its location at what times. But something at the size of 6 Earth mass or 10 Earth mass, an old proto gas giant that was flung out, that is stronger than the sun gravitationally in a very wide zone in the outer reaches of the solar system, doing a whole bunch of controlling and maneuvering. And that's a whole new concept of how do we think about the solar system, and then also how do we think about consciousness. Like we look at Pluto as this very powerful planet when it conjuncts things, and there's something to that. Well, make that Jupiter floating around even further out, and now it's really shatters kind of your perceptions of stuff. And so I've been playing with that a little bit. And it also kind of speaks to, let's say, you could say the power of dark forces is not to be underestimated. I think one of the things that is kind of rubs me the wrong way is people the light's already won. I'm like, well, that's what they would want you to say. That's what the darkness would want you to say.
Exactly. Yeah, then you relax.
Yeah, the work's all done, guys.
There's a good paradox here, brother.
So
there's a good paradox here, which I think is worth sharing, is that technically the light always wins for a variety of reasons. However, that doesn't mean we sit back on the sofa and do nothing, because that then allows the dark, in that kind of dualistic way of looking at things, to win. So it's at a quantum perspective, we have a perception, we create an intention, but then there has to be some follow through in the 3D, which would be the fire elemental, to give action to it. And that's what ensures that outcome happens. It's not that you sit back, on your sofa, you have a nice idle thought about something, and that's it. You don't give any energy to it, because that is missing part of the whole process. But first of all, I just want to say, you know, I love your thought process. It's very similar to ours. We take these readings, or pulses as we call them, from different directions, but then we run them through our own body system and see, when did they come into our awareness? What was the astrological precision, as you've realized with yourself? And what does that mean to me personally? Well, I mean, the more you do that, the more you see synchronicity at work. And the more you see synchronicity at work, you realize that everything is interrelated. In the world of plants, we link this very much to dandelion, who's a plant who shows us that the only thing that truly exists is the present moment, or now. He shows that very, very clearly the more you work with him. But to come back to Planet X, and I think maybe for the last 5 minutes or so, we'll get into the eclipse itself. But there is some esoteric philosophy out there to do with more galactic cosmology that suggests that the Kuiper Belt objects are the remnants of an exploded planet, possibly called Maldek. And that the asteroid belt is actually the exploded remnants of a planet called Tiamat, all of which, in more esoteric, we can say Anunnaki history, relate to the emergence of Nibiru into our solar system. Now, some people like Sitchin might say that Nibiru was Planet X. What you're presenting to me doesn't suggest that. It suggests something different again. But what we're starting to see and understand is that the history of our universe is also not quite what we've understood it to be until now. What I love about science, but it often forgets, is that science is great at proving things, but also at disproving its own facts. And so when we've had science held up over the last 4 years as the irrefutable truth, I'm like, well, that's not a great basis when it's consistently proving itself to be wrong, which is the great thing about science, because it's always testing its own theories. But if we hold it up to be the absolute truth, as many scientists have tried to do over the last 4 years, we have this kind of incoherency that starts to emerge. So I think what is really important is to take these different pulses on the research from respected sources, whatever they might be. Also look at the astrology and the timing of stuff, but most importantly of all is to run it through our own body medicine and see, how does it feel to me? Does that resonate? Does that somehow strike a chord, or is that something that's like, oh no, that doesn't make any coherent sense to me? And so I think that this is a very important motif to share with all of our audiences when we're trying to ascertain what is truth or not. These are really great mechanisms that Stefan is sharing with us here, and that we also use ourselves, right?
I want to share something that is part of the Mayan course, and in the module about the more galactic influences, they were actually convinced, and they tracked the movement of the Pleiades and Alcyon, and they saw our sun and our solar system as rotating around Alcyon. And then Alcyon being a much bigger system that obviously goes around the galaxy. So the center of the galaxy would be Hunabku, like the great central sun. Then the central sun would be Alcyon, and then our sun. So there was a 3-sun system that they followed and tracked. So, you know, we haven't even thought about those things yet. We're just trying to discover more planets in our solar system, but we are part of much bigger systems around the galaxy.
And actually, also just to add to that, before we go into the final a few minutes, Stefan, I wanted to ask you about the eclipses. Also, I saw you did a piece on Göbekli Tepe, which we also understand has been aligned with the star Deneb Aldigi, which actually was in the cosmology that we follow, the galactic cosmology, was triggered by the Pluto Cazimi that happened in the first couple of degrees of Aquarius. What was it? Probably about 6 to 8 weeks ago now. And that actually tied up with that. So we're also understanding that our ancestors tracked other stars that have not been so much in our awareness, but clearly were important for them. And if we understand that Göbekli Tepe perhaps was deliberately covered, as some archaeologists think, but has now re-emerged, how much more of our history is going to suddenly re-emerge at the moment that it's needed to? And a bit like the synchronistic finding of the information about your ascendant and all of that stuff, you know, when they went to look for Troy, they finally found it. Up until that point, it had been considered a myth. So does the past really exist until we go to look for it, or was it always there? A bit like, you know, when the tree falls in the forest but nobody saw it, did it really happen? You know, I think that these are all kinds of things that are interesting to play with. But for the final 5 minutes, let's talk about the eclipse. And, you know, we mentioned it somehow in regards that entities can come through. Well, what I understand is that an eclipse is a deep portal into space, and anything can come through it. We can consider them good, bad, light, dark. That's kind of subjective depending on our dualistic sense of reality here. But what I would like to suggest, and I'd love your take on this, Stefan, is, do you agree with that? Do you see it potentially as a portal through which light code, information, deep galactic positive information can come? Or maybe on the lower frequencies, it's also a portal through which other less helpful stuff can come? Or do you have a completely different perspective?
Well, if we zoom out a little bit, like for example, those eclipses happening with Jupiter and Saturn, like literally probably every day, because they have Jupiter has like 70 plus planets. They're finding new ones all the time, right? And Saturn has even more, as far as we know. Uranus has a lot of planets. Neptune, like they all have a lot of planets. And of course, they don't have that perfect match. You know, Titan doesn't block out the sun, as far as we know. I mean, maybe it does. But what's interesting is that the size of the moon relative to the size of Earth is an anomaly. The only system that we know of that's kind of similar is Pluto and Charon, and Pluto is much smaller than the Earth. I mean, Pluto is smaller than our moon, right? So Charon is like half the size of Pluto, but the moon is anomalously large as a satellite, and we are holding on to it. It's one of the biggest objects in the solar system once we go past the main planets. And Venus doesn't have one, Mercury doesn't have one, Mars doesn't have one. I mean, Mars has 2 moons, but they're just like little asteroids, you know, not this big thing. So clearly we have a very powerful, large celestial influence from the moon on the Earth, just based on that. And then, of course, the sun. So the two of them making a precise alignment definitely would alter the energy field in such a way to make that a unique moment for our location in space-time. Because you get an eclipse from one of these Jupiterian moons, and it's probably like, you know, a mosquito biting Jupiter or something. It's like, oh, you know, whatever. This happens all the time. But you have the moon, and all of a sudden you see, like, you know, an eagle is like coming to like eat your face or something. So a little bit of a bigger influence. That's my best metaphor. So there's I think if we're talking about like the universe and cosmos and everything, we can look at dimensions beyond space-time. So beyond time and beyond space. And of course, the whole then everything is laid out at once. But in regards to like some moments have certain qualities compared to others. And so, yeah, that moon, sun, earth dynamic during eclipses would be, at least in our solar system, pretty unique and would resonate with certain energies. And I like to think of the planetary geometries and the overall solar system as being like the foundational morphic field for us. And so at our location in the field, it's going to take on inherent like special properties. And I think special things can happen then. If we go back to like our kind of understanding of time being a spiral, I think one of the things that determines where you are in that spiral is your consciousness, because there is fate and there's also free will. And I think fate gives us certain things that we then have the free will to choose. So there can be option A, B, C, D, or E, you know, infinity, really, but they all have a certain flavor, like an infinite amount of vanilla flavors for your ice cream. You can have vanilla, but there's an infinite variety of vanilla. And so then it's your consciousness to choose which one. And some people just like, they're used to this plain old regular vanilla. They're like, I'll get regular vanilla. Then some people choose French vanilla. Other people choose Madagascar vanilla. Some people choose vanilla custard. And, you know, there's all these different ones. But I think the more conscious you are, the more you can climb that spiral faster and choose that higher consciousness fate option. And so then you're stuck less in this lower karmic loop, and you quickly go up to this other timeline. And that can be one way of thinking about timelines, is that it's what the choice that you make sets a trajectory different. And it can be quite a radical shift, but still the same fate. And so fate kind of spirals like this. My understanding is it spirals. And so if you took the first option and then the next time you're offered vanilla, you then did the French vanilla, and then it comes around again, and now you choose Madagascar vanilla. Eventually you'll be like, well, I had the other three. Let me choose the vanilla custard now. But if you just go right for the vanilla custard, boom, you're there. And so you don't have to wait 40 years or something, you know, or 4 eclipse cycles. So, but every experience will be different. But the energetics of that is the same. So I think everyone has their own eclipse energies based on their own astrological energetic influences. And so I think a lot of this timeline talk is in many ways like just how can we navigate our unique energetic situations that we will go through during eclipse with the most love, grace, compassion, consciousness, and highest vibrational frequencies. Like let's just, you know, be calm, think things through, also stand up for ourselves, you know, sovereign power, like all those types of themes, right? This, how can we navigate this the best for ourselves and for others, and really from that perspective of like one love. And if you do that, I think you can very quickly just almost maybe just spiral all the way to the top. But yeah, at least it's an idea. It's a nice one.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. And we did the same with the quantum compass. In the quantum compass show, we include the wave spill that is going to cover this 13-day period. It starts on the 8th of April, and the energy is the energy of the white dog, which is all about love, compassion, loyalty, thinking about the collective rather than ourselves. And that's exactly what we said. We want to bring more light. We want to bring more love, more compassion, more tolerance, and even the idea of the Christ consciousness, even stronger at this moment.
Right, and I think what you said as a summary is brilliant, Stefan, and I totally agree with that. It's really where we put our intention and how much light we wish to call forth into this space. And there may be other beings on the planet who want to do something different, but that's their fate, their free will, however they want to choose to do that. And I think the most important thing is to bring it back to ourselves, so we can say the Ascension is coming to an ice cream shop near you very soon, everybody, depending on which flavor you wish to choose. So I love that. I think that's an excellent way to wrap up today's show. And I think, just to add to what Bella said, the energy of this wave spell is of the white magnetic dog, which is the heart. And when I think about that, I think about unconditional love, which is really also the energy of the fifth dimension, or we could even say heaven in more biblical terms, the realm of the goddess and creativity. So if we put our attention to that and call that forth, that is how our world would look, both at the individual and the collective level.
Yeah.
So I want to give a big shout out of thanks to Stefan for joining us today, probably from somewhere on the other side of our planet, and for sharing his wisdom and his probing mind into various different research threads that we find very interesting. As always, I want to thank my partner and co-founder of all of the work that we do, Bella Alvaran, bringing through the Mayan stuff. And hopefully we've managed to bring some different threads together here to at least give some food for thought. We're not really saying anything definitively, because we're also not super sure about any of this, but we're having fun exploring it and trying to ensure that our consciousness is continuing to expand, so that we don't get ourselves put into little boxes and limited by other people's narratives or opinions. So take what resonates, discard what doesn't. Have fun, everybody, and we'll see you all again very soon, probably on the other side of the eclipse, however that looks for us all. So take it easy. Thank you again, brother.
Thank you, Stefan.
We'll see you all again very soon. Ciao.
Thank you so much.